Hello and welcome to a video about our beta version of the new cross-year indicative payments report. Why have we created this report? Much of our apprenticeship funding is paid in contracts which cross over 2 or more ILR years, in particular procured non-levy apprenticeships and apprenticeships where the employer is on the apprenticeship service and the contract for services is between the employer and the provider. This can include employers who pay the levy and increasingly employers who don't pay the levy. This means that around the period from August to November, our payments to providers can cover multiple ILR years in a single payment. We know that this makes it more difficult to reconcile payments back to ILR reports, and we also know it causes problems where a provider's accounting year is the same as our ILR year. We investigated whether we could change our systems to identify the payments separately, but there are technical constraints which mean that it wasn't feasible to separate the payments. Therefore, this year we have created this new report. We are issuing it as a beta version for this year and we aim to add further improvements for next year. This table shows how values from the different ILR collections are combined into payments for the apprenticeship contracts where we combine values across years. Here are some characteristics of the new report. We have tried to focus the report on the payment values which we know are more difficult to reconcile. So the report only covers the apprenticeships where there are cross-year contracts. There are other apprenticeships funded in contracts where there is a separate contract number for each ILR year. These are not included in this report as we believe they are easier to reconcile. By the same token, the report only covers the 4-month period from R12 to R03. This is the period when we believe the payments are more difficult to reconcile. The intention of the report is to take information which is available elsewhere, such as your contract values and the ILR funding summary reports produced at period end after each ILR collection closes, and then show an indicative calculation of how the payments were derived from those values. This report is indicative only and does not reflect payments which we have made outside of our main systems. Also, if the contract values changed at around the time we produced the report, this may also make the report inaccurate. This year, we are producing the report after the ILR R03 collection. Next year, we intend to start issuing the report earlier in the year. Where can I find the cross-year indicative payments report? The report is available from our service, Submit Learner Data. The report is within the section Submission History, and it has been created for the year 2020 to 2021 as one of the R03 period end reports. The report is named the Beta Cross-Year Indicative Payments Report. Note that we are not currently planning to produce versions of this report for later periods until we get close to the cross-year period at the end of this year. In our remittance advices and in this report, we will use the terminology of reconciliation and capping. The reconciliation value is the difference between the latest cumulative actuals value this month and the total we've paid so far in previous months for that contract reference. For capping, if the latest cumulative actual value for a month is above the maximum contract value, the capping value is what we subtract to bring the reconciliation value back down to the contract value. For contracts in this report, capping applies to non-levy procured contracts, and we apply the capping over financial years from the start of April to the end of March. We do not apply capping for contracts where the employer is on the apprenticeship service, because those contracts are not allocated a contract value. For example, suppose the contract value for a financial year was £100,000. In month 1, which is going to be our first month, the cumulative actual value is £80,000. The previous payment is 0, so the reconciliation value is the cumulative value minus 0, which is £80,000. We are still below the maximum contract value, so there is no capping. This gives a net payment for month 1 of £80,000. For month 2, the cumulative actual value is now £105,000. The reconciliation value is the new cumulative total minus the total payments so far, which is £105,000 minus £80,000, giving a reconciliation value of £25,000. However, that cumulative value of £105,000 is now above the contract value of £100,000. This means a capping adjustment of minus £5,000, which is 105 minus £100,000. For the net payment for the month, we combine the reconciliation and capping values. 25 minus £5,000 gives a net payment for the month of £20,000. For month 3, we have a cumulative actual value of £110,000. The reconciliation value is the new cumulative total minus the total payment so far, which is £110,000 minus £100,000, giving a reconciliation value of £10,000. You can see that even though the cumulative value has only gone up by £5,000, because of some of last month's actuals weren't paid due to capping, the reconciliation value is £10,000. The capping value is minus £10,000 because the new cumulative total of £110,000 is £10,000 above the contract value of £100,000. The net payment for month 3 is the combination of reconciliation and capping, which is 10,000 minus 10,000, giving a total of 0, so there is no net payment in month 3. Now suppose that before we made the payments for month 4, we increased the contract value to £110,000, which was the cumulative total of actuals up to month 3. So for month 4, we have a new cumulative total of £117,000. The reconciliation value is the new cumulative total minus the total payment so far, which is 117 minus £100,000, giving a reconciliation value of £17,000. For capping, our new contract allocation has been increased to £110,000, but the new cumulative total of £117,000 is still above that by £7,000, so the capping value is minus £7,000. For the net payment, the reconciliation and capping values together are £17,000 minus £7,000, giving a total net payment for month 4 of £10,000. So let's take a look through the elements of the report. To start with, we will work from left to right in the section for procured non-levy contracts for apprentices aged 16 to 18. The contract number should be the same as the number you see on your remittance advice for this contract. You will see that sometimes we show multiple contract numbers where these have changed. The period column shows the periods we use for contract values, and for these contracts this is our April to March financial year. The FSR period refers to the funding summary report, and this shows the 8-month and 4-month periods which we use on that report. Then we have the ILR year, which is the normal year we use for other ILR reports. You can see that the period column is merging together the April to July and August to March elements to show a financial year from April to March. The ILR year also merges the cells, but this time the August to March element is first and then the April to July element follows it. Columns E and F set the baseline figures for the report. The main report starts at ILR period R12, so columns E and F show the values up to R11. Column E shows the funding summary report values for the previous ILR years 2017-18 and 2018-19. These are split into the 8-month and 4-month periods within the ILR year, as we would show within the report itself. The 2017-18 figures start from January 2018, as that was when the procured non-levy contract started. These figures are repeated in later sections of the report, and they don't change because the ILR funding data for those years does not change. However, because we calculate payments back to the start of the contract in January 2018, sometimes those figures are required to understand your remittance advice, so we have included them in this report. Column F shows the total payments since the start of the contract up to period R11, which should be payments up to July 2020. In some cases there will have been manual payments which are not included in this figure. The section from columns G to J shows indicative payments for August 2020 from ILR period R12 of the 2019 to 2020 ILR year. We started from R12 as a way of establishing the way the report works, starting with the period where the payment should be less complex. Column G shows contract values. These contract values can be seen in our service Manage Your Education and Skills Funding, in the Contracts and Agreements section. Within this service, you, or perhaps a colleague who has access to the service, can look at various contracts. As an example, I've chosen a version of the procured non-levy contract which was signed before the R12 period close. This shows me a PDF file which I can download. Inside the PDF document is a section which shows the contract values, which looks something like this. We can see that the allocation figures cover April to March financial years and are not separated by ILR years. These are the values for the 16 to 18 contract, which we will use in the cross-year report. Going back to the report in Excel, we can see where those allocation figures appear in the report. The figures below for adult apprentices within the non-levy procured contract work in a very similar way. Column H shows the latest values across all the funding summary reports up to R12. The values for 2017-18 and for 2018-19 don't change from the values shown in column E. However, the values for 2019-20 should reflect the R12 period end funding summary report. If we look at an example of this report, this is the section for 16 to 18 non-levy procured contracts. Moving across, we can see the subtotals for the August to March and April to July periods. The totals for 16 to 18 non-levy procured are 642,636 for August to March and 235,644 for April to July. Going back to the cross-year report, we can see that those same values appear in column H of this report. Column I shows R12 reconciliation. You may remember that the reconciliation value is the difference between the latest cumulative actuals value this month and the total we have paid so far in previous months for that contract allocation. In this case, we take the totals from all the funding summary report values in column H and we subtract the payments up to R11, which were in column F. The indicative payment below this is adjusted by a capping value from column J, in this case 36 pence. The capping value is a comparison between the latest cumulative total, which comes from the funding summary report values in column H, compared to the contract values in column G. In this case, the funding summary report actual value for that first period is £20,347.36. At some point, the contract value has been amended to reflect that same value, but this has been done to the nearest pound, which is £20,347. Therefore, the funding summary report value is above the contract value, and capping of 36 pence applies. In a scenario like this, the capping value would still show in each month's remittance advice, as the calculation works back to the start of the contract. The capping is calculated for the same period as the contract values. This is shown using merged cells to represent financial years. For example, these two funding summary report values for the financial year April 2019 to March 2020 are compared against the contract value of 1.067 million. In this case, there is no capping, but if there was, it would also be calculated at that combined level. You will also notice that the two funding summary report values which are being combined come from two separate ILR years here. The capping and reconciliation values are combined together as an indicative payment in this cell in column I, which is the sum of the reconciliation and capping values in columns I and J. That brings us to the end of the calculation of the indicative payment for August for this contract type. The indicative payment for September is calculated in a very similar way, this time from R01 data. The contract values are shown as at the day after the R01 period end. In most cases these will be the same as at R12, but it is possible that they might have changed. In the FSR column, there is a new value for the 2020 to 21 ILR year. This should agree with the value from the R01 period end funding summary report for the first delivery month in the report. The FSR values for earlier years are repeated from the R12 FSR column. As before, the reconciliation value comes from the new cumulative total from the funding summary reports, from which we subtract the payments so far. For the purpose of this report, we calculate the payments so far as last month's cumulative funding summary report value minus any capping which applied last month. The capping for this month works in a very similar way to before, using the updated funding summary report values. In this case, there are no changes to capping. And as before, the indicative payment for this month is the reconciliation figure minus any capping. For indicative payments in October, the structure of the report changes slightly, because now we are using funding summary report values from two collections, R13 and R02. There is an additional column for the R13 funding summary report values. The values for the ILR year 2019-20 will have been updated to agree with the values from the R13 period end funding summary report. As before, the contract values would be updated if they have changed. Then the R02 funding summary report column repeats the updated values from the R13 report, along with a new value for the ILR year 2020-21. This time, the ILR 2020-21 value shows the first two delivery months from the R02 period end funding summary report. This gives us a new cumulative total which combines the R13 and the R02 updates. The reconciliation and capping values are calculated in the same way as before, based on the latest contract values and updated funding summary report data from collections R13 and R02. The section for November indicative payments, which come from R14 and R03 data, is very similar to the previous months. The funding summary report values for the ILR year 2019-20 are updated to show the values as at the R14 period end funding summary report. The funding summary report column for R03 shows those 19-20 values plus an updated value for the 2020-21 ILR year, which covers the first three delivery periods of the year, as shown on the R03 period end funding summary report. The capping and reconciliation values are calculated in the same way as before, and that is the final set of columns for this report. However, so far I've only really talked about information for the 16 to 18 non-levy procured contract. The section for adult non-levy procured contracts follows a very similar structure to the 16 to 18 section, so I won't go through that section. However, there are sections below for contracts where the employers are on the apprenticeship service, where there are some differences. For these sections, you will see that we have fewer rows in each section. These sections are only intended to show payments for the ILR years 2019-20 and 2020-21, unlike the non-levy procured sections above which go back further. So the payments up to R11 value should agree with all the payments from September 2019, which would correspond to R01, up to July 2020. However, those payments would have included some R13, R14 values from the 2018-19 ILR year. We need to exclude those values so that the next section can work only in terms of the 2019-20 ILR year. In order to deal with this, we have an extra value in column E, which shows only the R13 and R14 values from 2018-19. This figure should reflect the difference between the R14 and R12 funding summary reports at period end from 2018 to 19. The R13 and R14 payments from ILR data would also be shown in the 2018-19 R14 APPS monthly payment report. However, there may have been additional changes to the earnings adjustment statement for R13 and R14, which wouldn't be shown in the APPS monthly report. This means that the APPS monthly payment report, R13 and R14 values, might not agree with this column E figure. Moving to the section for indicative payments for August, you can see that this is a cut down version of the sections above. There are no maximum contract values for these contracts, which also means that there is no capping. We only show funding summary report values from the start of the ILR year 2019 to 20. The reconciliation value for R12 is where we apply that adjustment for 2018-19 R13 and R14 values. Instead of simply taking the R12 value and subtracting R11 from it, as we do above in the section for non-levy procured, for the levy contract, we take the R11 value and subtract the R13 to R14 adjustment. Then that combined value is subtracted from the R12 funding summary report total. The indicative payments for September again work like their equivalents above for non-levy procured contracts, but without contract values or capping. The funding summary report column is updated with the information from the R01 report, and the reconciliation value is the cumulative R01 value minus the cumulative R12 value. As before, when we get to the October indicative payments, we have two sets of funding summary report values, from R13 and from R02. Again, the reconciliation value is the difference between the cumulative values from R02 and R01. And the November indicative payment also follows the same pattern. Finally, we have the section for the new non-levy contract numbers where the employer is on the apprenticeship service but does not pay the levy. We amended levy contracts in the 2019-20 ILR year to start making payments for apprentices who work for these employers. There were no payments of this type in 2018-19, so we do not need to make the R13, R14 adjustment for 2018-19, which we needed to make for levy provision. This means that the R12 reconciliation is simply the difference between R12 and R11 cumulative values. Apart from that, this section follows the same structure as the levy section above. And that completes the walkthrough of this report. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for watching. If you want further information on this report, or to give us some feedback, use the ESFA Help webpage shown here. From there, you can use the option to contact us, or use the Talk to Our Community option to enter our discussion forum.